everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and tonight's video topic is a little bit different to the usual. We're still talking about esotericism, the occult, the hidden Western tradition of religion, but this time we're going to be talking about a very different type of Western religion, which is the old religion of Germanic and Anglo-Saxon paganism and Norse paganism, rather than what I usually talk about, my usual interests of Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and that type of Western spirituality. And the reason why we're venturing into that different territory is because I'm talking about the god Odin. And the reason we're doing that is because, in spite of my usual interests in the realm of Western esotericism, Odin has come into my life in a big way in the past year or so and has delivered some powerful spiritual lessons to me during that time. And so I wanted to honor those experiences by sharing them with you and sharing a little bit about my personal experiences connecting with the god Odin. It made me realize how underrated certain parts of our esoteric heritage are, and how much untapped wisdom and knowledge there really is in those places, and how figures like Odin, because they're so far outside the traditional, or what is now considered traditional Western beliefs, which draw heavily on Judeo-Christian morality and cosmology and everything else, and classical Greek philosophy. They're so far outside of that they can offer a very different perspective on certain questions, and perhaps even plug some of the holes that exist in the Western psychology, the Western way of looking at the world, and can enrich our understanding of the Western esoteric tradition. So to begin with, who is Odin? Well, Odin was the chief of the gods in a number of Germanic cultures in their form of paganism, such as the well-known Norse pagans, the Vikings, also the pagans in what is today known as Germany, the ancestors of the Germans, but also the Anglo-Saxons. So Odin is a very unique kind of a god. He's got lots of different traits associated with him, and I'm going to go through some of the most important ones. I have to admit, this is not my area of expertise, so there's neo-pagans who could go through the lore of Odin a lot better than I could, but I'll give you the highlights, which for me really is, first of all, that he's the king of the gods in Norse and Germanic paganism. He sits on his throne, which doubles as a watchtower overlooking the universe, overlooking Asgard. He's very much a god of order and civilization. And yet at the same time, he's very much a god of chaos. He can be a trickster. He likes to disguise himself in the form of a wanderer, an old man with a grey cloak who wanders here and there. And he does this in order to gain knowledge, in order to play tricks on mortals, and in fact to test them. And in that guise, he can often be an agent of chaos or disruption of the established order. So there's that very dual quality to Odin. He is a god who, like Mercury or Hermes or Thoth in Greek or Roman or Egyptian mythology, is associated with knowledge and the obtaining of knowledge and the giving of knowledge. And he was associated with Hermes by some classical thinkers. But he's more than that. He's also a god of war. The first war in the world, according to Odin's mythology, was caused when he threw his spear Gungnir. And that was the first act of war. And so he's a god of war. And his hall of Valhalla is where victorious warriors were said to pass on to, were taken to by the Valkyries if they passed in battle. So he has those associations with him as well. And he was also thought to be the god of the wild hunt, a celebration which is coming up pretty soon actually, which is one of the reasons why I decided to do this video today. So he's got all these different attributes, but he's probably most famous for the incredible lengths that he went to in order to obtain knowledge and wisdom. He was obsessed with obtaining as much knowledge as he could. And there's two famous stories. The first is when he went to the well of Mimir and sacrificed his own eye in order to obtain knowledge from that well. As a result of obtaining his knowledge, Odin learnt of the coming end of days, when the gods themselves would pass away in the final war of Ragnarok. And so, having obtained this knowledge, Odin obsessively tried to prepare for the coming of Ragnarok as much as he could, for the coming oblivion that was on the horizon. And so again, we see him in his role very much as a god of order and civilization. The second major story about Odin obtaining knowledge is when he hung on the world tree, Yggdrasil, for 9 days and 9 nights, pinned by his own spear, and hung suspended over the great abyss of Niflheim. As a result of that, after 9 days and 9 nights, he had a vision where he saw the runes. And this is where the mythic origins of the runes come from, which of course were used by pagans and are used by neo-pagans today as a form of divination, as well as creating bind runes as a form of practical magic, you might say. So this powerful magical language was obtained by Odin through another sacrificial act. And it's often said that Odin sacrificed himself to obtain this knowledge, and it's often seen as a kind of apotheosis that he went through by hanging on the tree like that. So all very interesting symbolism happening there, and very charged and powerful symbolism. I know I hung on that windswept tree, swung there for 9 long nights, wounded by my own blade, bloodied for Odin, myself an offering to myself, bound to the tree that no man knows, whither the roots of it run. None gave me bread, none gave me drink, down to the deepest depths I peered, until I spied the runes. With a roaring cry I seized them up, then dizzy and fainting I fell. Well-being I won, and wisdom too. I grew and took joy in my growth. From a word to a word, I was led to a word. From a deed to another deed. So there's a lot of different ways that Odin can be considered in this day and age, not merely as a pagan god, an anthropomorphic deity of some form, but Odin is sometimes regarded as someone who once lived as a mortal man, who was a great and powerful magician who was then raised to the status of a god later. And this reinventing of Odin from god to man is known as euhemerism. It's something that the Christian scholars did in the Anglo-Saxon world because the ancient kings of the Anglo-Saxon world saw themselves as the descendants of Odin, and so part of their royal claim was linked to being of the lineage of Odin, and yet Odin was a pagan god. So in order for that tradition to remain acceptable to the new Christian faith of the Anglo-Saxons, Odin had to be reinvented as an ordinary human being who had simply been mistaken as a god. But this has given rise to a theory that Odin is really just a title of a particularly wise human being. And by reaching that state, they merely embody a more divine force, which can be considered like another form of the god Odin. And here again we see Odin envisaged in a different way to how he was probably traditionally understood, as like a disembodied force that animates the universe, rather than as an anthropomorphic being. So there's lots of different ways that Odin has been interpreted over the years and the centuries. Odin, as I've said, was not a god that I sought out. He kind of just came into my life unexpectedly. How did that happen exactly? Well, I've gone into it a little bit in my Crossing of the Abyss Part 2 video that I recently did, but I'll go over it again briefly. So really it began when I was studying Reiki under my Reiki master, Travis, who would have had his birthday today, actually, if he was still with us. So happy birthday, Trav. And anyway, one of Trav's interests other than Reiki was the runes. And so he introduced me to the runes as a result of me going to learn Reiki from him. And I didn't show much of an interest in first, but I absorbed the information. I took the books that he gave me on the topic. And so it was beginning to kind of percolate in my consciousness that way, because of course Odin is the progenitor of the runes. And then the next connection with Odin that presented itself was as a result of my genealogical research. I discovered that there were certain people from the German as well as English side of my family who claimed descent from Odin at some point. And this is not as uncommon as you might think. All of the old Anglo-Saxon kings claimed descent from Odin. This is a very established thing in royal genealogies. It's very well documented in, for example, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And there were other people and groups in the Germanic world who likewise claimed some kind of descent from Odin, such as the Erminones, for example, claiming descent from Irmin, who is often identified with Odin. And that was one of the lines that I was able to discover. But, lots of people, millions of people probably are descended from such figures. And, even having royal or noble lineages is not that unusual. Most people in Western Europe, who are born in Western Europe, are probably descended from Charlemagne. A lot of people who are born in the UK are probably descendants of William the Conqueror. So it's not actually that uncommon to find these kinds of lineages in one's family line. What's not common is for people to have the audacity to believe that they come from such lofty roots and to go looking for it. Not that I went looking for it in this case, but when you search deeply for something, when you're determined to find something meaningful, you will eventually find it. And it is in that act of the pursuit, the untiring pursuit of knowledge, that greatness is won. And that is very much a theme of tonight's video. That's very much the sentiment of Odin himself. So now I had a few things connecting me suddenly to the god Odin. It was not a connection that I was looking for, but it was clearly becoming something that was important that I needed to explore more. So I decided to put the runes into practice, and I did a reading to find out why Odin was coming into my life so strongly. And without going into too much detail, I basically got the message that Odin was there to help me cross the abyss, as a guide to help me do that. I mean, there's some reasons why Odin would be well placed to do that. If you think about the ordeal on the tree of Yggdrasil, it is very similar to a crossing of the abyss type of ritual that Odin put himself through. And it's an example of self-sacrifice and taking huge risks in order to obtain knowledge. So it makes sense that Odin would help in that regard. He's very much also a walker between worlds and a symbol of change and transformation. So in that regard, Odin would be well placed as a guide to help in the crossing of the abyss as well. And just to introduce me to some new spiritual lessons, those were the main reasons for Odin entering my life. So it was the 30th of November last year that I did that reading. And during that reading, I got a taste firsthand for the power of Odin. Because as the reading drew to a close, and I thought that I had drawn all the runes that I needed to draw to get my message, I suddenly heard, like audibly heard, a voice behind me. And the voice, it was like a raspy elderly voice. And the voice said, "Win!" Like that. Just like that, just out of nowhere. And I looked behind me, there was nothing. The cat was there, that's it. And then a window looking out into the garden. There was nobody there. But I heard this voice giving me this word, win. And as I did some research into what this could mean, I learnt that win is the Anglo-Saxon name for the rune Wunjo, which is a rune of luck and good fortune. So somebody was wishing me good fortune at the end of the reading, and I've got reason to believe that it was Odin himself. So that gave me a taste of the power and the potency of this particular god. And I knew I was in for quite an intense experience working with this god. But as I said in my Crossing the Abyss Part 2 video, I didn't work with Odin as a god, as such, like an act of worship like a neo-pagan might in working with Odin. It was much more of an ancestor working. I was approaching Odin as an ancestral spirit and as an ancestral guide rather than a god who I was worshipping. And yet I was still able to learn a lot from Odin. I learnt lessons about suffering and using suffering as a tool for self-overcoming. You know, we all suffer in life. It's unavoidable. Using suffering as a tool for spiritual growth is not to say that suffering is a good thing and we should gaslight ourselves into believing that. But if we're going to suffer anyway, we might as well turn that around into a tool that we can use for personal growth. And that was one thing that Odin really taught me how to do. Through his example, hanging on the world tree, one of the ways that I tried to connect with Odin was by meditating on an Othala rune, the rune of the ancestors, and I was able to receive some meditative visions by doing this. And one of them was of him on the world tree giving me this lesson about suffering and how basically pushing through suffering can bring us closer to divinity, to becoming God-like ourselves, because we're overcoming our limitations. The thing that makes us suffer is that we've reached the limitation of ourself, where we are separated from the rest of the universe, and we become aware of that separation. We become aware of that limit to our being. And so rather than recoiling from that, if we push through the suffering to the other end, then that is a way we can sacrifice ourselves to ourselves and become something more. Another important thing that Odin taught me was how to appreciate dark divinity and to understand that there's a difference between the dark side of the divine and spiritual evil. So if you think about the universal order, there's day and there's night. There's predators and there's prey. The night can be scary, it can be foreboding from our point of view, but it's not inherently evil. The night plays a role. If we had daytime all the time, then the earth would be scorched by the sun, and there would be no opportunity for rest as people sleep at night. So the night seems ominous and dark and scary, but it has a role to play. And predators as well seem like they have an evil nature. They go out and they hunt other living things. But if a predator didn't go out and hunt other living things, then those species would become a pest and they would overrun the local ecosystem and they would cause imbalance and everything would perish as a result. So the predator actually plays a role in maintaining order and balance in the natural world. So we see again and again that there is a dark and a light side to creation, And the dark is just as necessary as the light. And it's not evil because it's serving the greater purposes of order. Evil really arises when something, which we usually associate with the darker side of life, begins encroaching too much and causing that disorder and causing that distortion of creation. But it can just as easily be something that comes from the lighter side as well. You think about some of the movements that have arisen that have had a sense of moral righteousness, that have sought to purify and cleanse the world. And some followers of Odin would know all about that now, wouldn't they? But so it's not necessarily always the darker aspects of creation that are responsible for evil in the first place. It can just as easily come from the light. And I think Odin is a god who moves between light and dark. He can be a very benevolent figure, but he can also be very disruptive, for some greater purpose, but still seem quite disruptive. He's a war god, so he can be quite ominous in that veneer. And, he can be a psychopomp as well. He can move between the worlds of the living and the dead. And so he has that darker aspect there as well. But it's not a darkness that's evil. And I think that that's a distinction we need to learn to make a lot more in the West, because our psyche associates anything dark with the demonic as a result of centuries of Christianity. And it means that there's a lot of things that we're not integrating. And Odin is a god which encourages us to overcome that as we contemplate the complexity of the character of Odin. And while we're on the topic of the Christian heritage of the West, I think that there are some moral qualities or perhaps character traits that Odin has, which are refreshingly different to the character traits of more Christian figures, and actually bring something that is sorely missing back into the Western psyche. Because of that complexity, because of that ambiguity, because of that greyness that Odin has, he's able to straddle the light and the dark and perhaps even start to reconcile the polarized and fractured psyche of the Western mind, which is something that the West sorely needs. We've had centuries of Christianity, and Christian morality has been very useful. It is truly elevated the moral and spiritual standards of the Western human being from what it was in pre-Christian times, and that's a great thing. But by setting the bar so high, we've also condemned a lot of facets of the human experience and pushed a lot into the shadows and made the shadow of the collective Western unconscious very big. And in the last 100 years or so, that shadow has started to explode to the surface in the form of extremist political movements, in the form of antinomian religious movements, which are, embracing Satan as the hero and the Beast 666 as the hero and so forth. And, it's an attempt by a collective psyche that is desperate to correct itself after being held in one polar extreme for so long. But the problem is, a lot of that is just, it's a reaction that goes to a different extreme. You end up again, with a fractured psyche and a one-sided psyche. And what I started to see in the figure of Odin was somebody who answered and rebutted all of the weaknesses of Christianity, of the Christian moral worldview, without going into being a representative of complete evil, like Satan or the beast or something like that. He's still a god of order and civilization, but he had these darker aspects to him as well, which allowed him to navigate the darkness while not losing sight of that higher purpose of being a force for order in the universe. And that really, to me, is a better way of reconciling Christ with Christ's shadow in the Western psyche, which is certainly something I've experienced in my own personal spiritual life. I was very Christian when I was younger, and then I became a Thelemite and was very invested in the Beast 666 as kind of like the antithesis to that, and the answer to all of the contradictions and weaknesses within Christianity. But that is also an extreme and quite inadequate. And now finally, by discovering Odin, I was able to find something which I could connect to personally within my spiritual life, in this case, in the ancestor work that I was doing, which also allowed me to find the way between those two extremes. Odin has many similarities with Christ. He sacrificed himself. Some would say that the difference between Odin's sacrifice and Christ's sacrifice is that Christ sacrificed himself for all humanity, whereas Odin sacrificed himself to himself, but all of humanity has benefited from the knowledge that he gained. So they're not too dissimilar from one another. Odin, much like at least the Gnostic or the esoteric Christ, is a great initiator of human beings into spiritual mysteries, mysteries to do with unlocking self-knowledge. He's a man who became a god, much like Christ. He is the archetype of the divine king, and he's also a psychopomp. However, the difference between Odin and Christ that I can see is a moral one. That's the big difference. Christ always upholds very high moral standards, even choosing to die rather than contravene those moral standards, putting oneself in harm's way and denying oneself justice for being wronged in the case of upholding those moral standards. Odin does not share that restrictive morality. While Odin does encourage us to be, the best, most virtuous people we can be, Odin as a figure often ventures outside the bounds of conventional morality to achieve his goals. He can be a very amoral figure. And sometimes someone who's in a position of authority needs to make decisions where there might be some moral ambiguity. One who truly embodies the king archetype has to be prepared to make those kinds of decisions. You can't always make a moral choice in that position. Odin's character captures that complexity a lot better. And even when Odin is being cunning or manipulative, even violent, he always is serving some higher purpose, some higher goal, some greater good in everything that he does, even when his actions do seem morally ambiguous. And, as I was starting to get into earlier in this video, having that high standard of morality, as the Christian worldview presents, can also leave us weakened if it's taken to an extreme. It means people can take advantage of us if we're too generous, if we keep our guard down too much, and we give more than perhaps we should, because we think about the Olivet Discourse, and we don't want to be the goats who didn't feed the stranger and didn't welcome the stranger. Some strangers just want to come into our house in order to destroy us from within. An excess of Christian morality makes us blind to that fact and leads us down a path of self-destruction as a result of being too open. Sometimes avoiding conflict is not always the best solution to evil in the world. Turning the other cheek has become a notorious saying for just taking disrespect. I don't think that that's how Christ originally meant it, but that is the stereotype of Christian morality that has come out of the misinterpretation of Christ's teachings. To be a pushover, to be a pacifist, to be a nice guy who always finishes last because he doesn't want to enter into any conflict, because that would be evil. Odin, on the other hand, is not afraid to throw the spear if that's what needs to happen in that particular situation. I think that studying the mythology of Odin can bring us a deeper and fuller understanding of the Western esoteric tradition. Most of the Western esoteric tradition comes from Jewish or Christian forms of mysticism, and really from Greek forms of spirituality, because those were the kind of socially acceptable ways that you could find alternative truths. Well, they weren't socially acceptable. The church would still label you a heretic for following the Western esoteric tradition, but they at least had a certain respectability about them because of where they came from, whereas something like Germanic neo-paganism would have just been seen as straight from the devil. So perhaps there's a reason why the Western esoteric tradition has preserved the particular Western traditions that it has, and not others. But you know, we live in a different time now where the church is not breathing down everybody's necks about what they can and can't believe. So why not reintroduce the runes, for example, into the Western esoteric tradition? The runes are very similar to something like Hebrew, functionally, as a magical language. They come from the same source as Hebrew, namely the Phoenician alphabet, same as the Greek alphabet. There's a lot of similarities between a figure like Odin and, say, Thoth. So why not start to explore some of the richness of that belief system? And I think that Odin, particularly in his guise as the wanderer with the broad-brimmed hat and the grey robe, is a more fulsome embodiment of the archetype of the magician. His robe is grey because he incorporates both the light and the dark. And he is the inspiration for some of the greatest wizards of all time. He is the inspiration for Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. When you think of a wizard, the archetypal image that your psyche conjures up is an image that is most likely derived from Odin. So those are my thoughts on Odin, what I've learnt about Odin, how he came into my life, and the spiritual lessons that I learnt from him, whether it's to do with my relationship with suffering, with self-overcoming, or appreciating the dark side of divinity and finding a way of being comfortable with transcending conventional morality while still serving a higher good. These are all things that Odin taught me, and I think they are lessons that are more broadly applicable to society and, you know, people who are on a spiritual path. So that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to this channel to support my work, hit the notification bell so you get notified of my future videos, leave your comments down below, and hit join or thanks to support me further. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.